The time has come for the Cobra to rise up and reveal himself.
Welcome back, my quiver of capitalists, to AP Economics, presented by Cobranomics, your all-American history teacher, gold standard of economics, le champion of classical liberalism, and sensei of supply side, Professor G here. And today we are going to take a look at Unit 6, Lesson 2, continuing our side effects of fiscal and monetary policy, and today we are particularly going to take a look at inflationary expectations and rational expectations. And inflationary expectations has been around for a while in economics. Keynes mentions it as waves of pessimism, waves of optimism, but you could even go further back to Abraham Lincoln when he says you can't fool all of the people all of the time. And rational expectations and inflationary expectations is based on the idea that we have a good understanding of economics, we've seen things happen in the past, we remember it, and then when it happens again, we recall it and behave appropriately. So first we're going to take a look at a couple of other side effects that are going to lead to that. And remember, it's about fiscal and monetary policy working together, especially to solve recession and inflation, but especially recession. And first let's take a look at slight differences, things we've mentioned before, but just to put it in full terms, the idea of lags. There are two types of lags: recognition and implementation, and impact lag. And this is the difference of speed at which the federal government and Federal Reserve can both recognize and act on a situation and to implement it, a solution, but as well as their actions to take effect on the economy. Now, recognition lags, technically, we don't have full economic data for 3 months after something happens, technically. Like, you know, the full data, which is why graphs are so important, because it shows, okay, this happened, therefore this is where we are versus where we should be. So, but implementation is the speed at which an institution can recognize and then implement, come up with a solution. So for the Federal Reserve, especially the FOMC, the Federal Open Market Committee, it's much easier for 14 people to recognize and institute a solution versus Congress. You have 2 chambers of Congress, 100 in the Senate, 435 in the House of Representatives. Both have to agree on a solution, send it to all House spending bills start in the House, then it goes to the Senate, and then if the Senate approves, then it goes to the President, and then the President must approve or it gets kicked back down. So in terms of speed, the Federal Reserve has a much quicker implementation lag than the federal government. However, for impact, as we saw with the banking system, it takes longer for the Federal Reserve to impact an economy. It takes about 12 to 18 months to really feel the impact of Federal Reserve spending. So for the Fed, for the impact, about 12 to 18 months to really go full, that process to go fully through, as we saw with the fractional banking system, where excess reserves become loans, which become deposits, which become loans, throughout the course of the banking system. Versus the federal government, if the federal government does things like stimulus checks or job creation, like building a tunnel, building a bridge, building a subway, then the federal government, to feel the full effect of their spending, is 6 to 12 months. And this is the first kind of thing that can make people leery. The idea of inflationary expectations and rational expectations. That they know that as these two institutions are working on something, that even though, yes, the economy needs help, people will understand that we are talking billions, if not trillions of dollars in spending and in liquidity, and inflation might very well be on the way if all of this money is about to be injected into the economy. And they know it's coming, that in 12 to 18 months for the Federal Reserve and in 6 to 12 months for the federal government, the economy is going to start feeling this growth. And which is why, too, patience is a virtue. That just because the Federal Reserve or federal government creates a policy, that policy still has to work its way through the banking system and then aggregate demand, and then the circular flow model and the multiplier effect and aggregate demand. So results are not immediate. But rational expectations, people are still thinking about it and also thinking about the amount of money and that might be coming through the system and start planning ahead for that, which we're going to see in our next slide with rational expectations. The other thing we have to talk about before we get to fully rational expectations is that tremendous amount of money and a very shady thing the federal government and Federal Reserve does called debt monetization. So, federal government does deficit spending. To help to finance the deficit, the Federal Reserve with the Treasury will issue Treasury bonds. Bonds made available to the public that the public can buy. And as the public buys the bonds, they give money to the Federal Reserve. That money finances the government debt as it borrows for that money from the Fed. So we have people holding the bonds. So the public can hold part of the government debt. If people choose to buy government bonds, when the government issues bonds to finance deficit spending. But what the Federal Reserve can do is not just have the public hold the debt, but the Federal Reserve can have the Treasury Department print money give that money to the Federal Reserve, and then the Federal Reserve will use that money to, on the secondary market, buy those bonds from the public. So now, this accomplishes that the Federal Reserve essentially is holding the government's debt, and the Federal Reserve has also increased more money into the economy by giving people that money now, and now the Federal Reserve holds the bonds. So it's an intricate way to keep the debt in-house in our institutions, but again, this is just deficit spending flooding money, secondary market flooding money, and we have to be aware as households that too much money chasing too few products is going to create inflationary pressures. So now let's take a look at, if we react rationally, how our reactions can actually offset the effectiveness of federal policy. So rational expectations, really the theory is fully expounded by Robert Lucas, although it is evolving over the course of the 20th century. Robert Lucas is credited for putting it really all together. And as we said before, there is a lot of money that is going to be, people are expecting that money, not overnight, we have those lags, but people are expecting that money to be flooding the economy, and people start to think, well, too much money chasing too few products, people expect the government policy to cause inflation. And people have lived through the government spending trillions and trillions of dollars. And people bank that memory and they remember that you have a lot of money, there's a lot of money entering the economy with massive deficit and debt. So if people bank these memories, and even within the last 10 years in our country, we had 2009, 2010, we had the massive spending of TARP 1, TARP 2, President Obama's stimulus plan, and now in 2020 going to 21, we've had at least 4 massive spending bills by the government and President Trump, and by the Federal Reserve, trillions in liquidity by the Federal Reserve. And so in just these past 10 years alone, 2 extraordinary, in response to obviously crises, but 2 extraordinary instances of massive amounts of money entering the country. And people remember that. People remember that over the course of their lifetime. And remember that you're going to have all of this money flooding the economy, and this money could definitely, even though the goal, so here we have our goal, the goal is to take us from recession to where we should be, LRAS, back to full employment. That is a lot of money entering the economy, and too much money chasing too few products creates inflationary pressures and increases prices. So people acting rationally will say, well, if these policies are going to cause inflation, and this inflation is coming in a certain amount of time, well, people will react by guarding against inflationary expectations, by doing what they can to demand higher wages. But the demanding higher wages, acting rationally because of their inflationary expectations, so people think prices are going to increase, it's going to become more difficult to buy products. To alleviate this oncoming difficulty, people will demand those higher wages. However, demanding higher wages, acting rationally, will raise input costs for businesses, which will decrease the ability and willingness to produce, decreasing aggregate supply. So we see here, the government's goal is to shift aggregate demand to the right. Yes, that will increase prices, but the goal is to increase real GDP, to increase output. People will see the government gearing up for the spending, initiate these spending bills, or initiate the Federal Reserve initiating these open market operations and massive liquidity, and they will demand higher wages. So while the federal government is trying to push AD to the right, our own rational expectations are actually pushing aggregate supply to the left. And the result is that output will remain indeterminate or unchanged, and the end result, though, will be you'll have all of these shifts pulling the economy in different directions, and potentially what you could end up with is a less effective fiscal policy, so an indeterminate fiscal policy, an indeterminate output, because you have output being pushed in 2 directions. But what you will definitely have is increased price level. And so, ironically, unexpected events and unexpected policy work has a greater effect than when people expect it. Because when we expect it, like Abraham Lincoln said, you can fool some of the people, you can fool some of the people all the time, all the people some of the time, but not all of the people all of the time. And that's what rational expectations is. We've lived through events, we've seen the results of these events, we have an understanding of how the economy works, and in a minimum we have an understanding that a lot of money all at once, if production doesn't increase with that amount of money in the economy, we're going to have too much money chasing too few products. We want to protect our ability to provide and purchase goods, and therefore we will demand higher wages. And again, I gave 2 examples in just 10 years, unfortunately, in our country's history of these massive spending bills to try to alleviate problems. This is why, as a theme throughout the course, we always have to prepare our long-term assets against inflation by investing in aggressive retirement accounts early so that our money is growing at a rate greater than inflation, because we never know when something is going to happen that will decrease our purchasing power, and inflationary pressures are always happening, let alone when they happen en masse through government programs. So always invest hard, invest often, and no feelings in your retirement account. This has been Cobranomics, Unit 6, Lesson 2. Remember, money never sleeps. We'll see you next time.